Hello everyone, good afternoon. Oh, God, very bright and alert for this. Welcome to this policy exchange event on metro economies. How can cities exploit devolution to boost growth? Great question, obviously here in Manchester and here at the Conservative Conference. I'm John McDermott, political correspondent for the FT, and we have a great panel here to discuss cities and what we can do practically to try and boost growth across urban regions in the UK. Some of the questions we'll be looking at is how can city devolution accelerate the construction of new homes? What can cities do to attract, retain, develop skilled workers that businesses need? And what can cities here in the UK learn from cities around the world, and perhaps vice versa? I'll just briefly introduce the panel in the order in which they'll speak. There's Crew Desai, partner at KPMG, Steve Hughes, head of economics at Policy Exchange, Lord Holmes, Deputy Chancellor at BPP, Mike Emmerich, founding partner of Metro Dynamics, and Professor Brian Robson of the University of Manchester. Each of the panelists will speak for no more than 5 minutes. Please keep it pithy, keep it sharp, keep it pointed, keep it argumentative, and then I'll turn it over to your fine selves, who probably know far more about this topic than certainly myself. And we'll try and have a discussion, but as always, please keep your questions to questions. Without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Crew Desai. We'll talk for about 5 minutes.
So I think the instructions, if I heard them correctly, were keep it pithy, keep it sharp and argumentative. So here we go. This is a congested landscape. I arrived here a week after my previous attempt at doing this with our friends at Policy Exchange, and the Chancellor's stolen the march somewhat. What can we do? If you don't have a city deal, you're kind of lost. If you think you are getting fiscal freedom, probably not in the manner that you thought you were. A lot of excitement at the moment about the devolution of business rates, but when you look underneath the small print, there are some conditions. And it all boils down to, for me, leadership and the strength of a single point of accountable person in a region, in a city, that can actually deliver this growth programme, the economic growth programme. Not so much about politics, but about creating urban environments which are livable, where families and their children, where their dependents want to come and put down roots and want to live and work and play. And you can't get to that easily without having an integrated plan around infrastructure, around housing, around financing a city. And if I look at some of the work we've been involved in outside of the UK, acknowledging that most of my panellists will talk about the highly centralised nature of the UK system, what countries have done outside the UK is not worried too much about their relationship with government. They've taken some of their financial freedoms and they've gone straight out to other people, other private sector partners, public sector partners, and they've started thinking about being financially independent. And what that says to me is, here, to drive growth, you can go down the scheme, you can have a city deal, you can have devolution, you can have infrastructure projects, but unless you have an integrated view of your locality and the USP of your locality and how the ecosystem in your locality works around attracting financing, around changing the livelihoods and outcomes of people in your area, around being able to negotiate and compromise and work with the public and private sector, then you will not be able to drive growth in your city. It is not a single initiative, it is an integrated initiative. And be prepared to do something that's going to take 20 to 30 years before you see the real outcomes. And be prepared to be transparent and show the monitoring and evaluation of your efforts, because you're going to find it difficult to do that in the first 2 or 3 years or within an electoral cycle.
Oh, that was pithy.
You asked for it.
Since I've got a minute, some of that was fascinating, but rather vague at times.
Sure.
What did you mean by a kind of integrated plan and needing to be transparent? Or actually, rather than kind of what did you mean, if you could pick one city that you've been impressed by in your globe-trotting efforts,
sure,
which one would it be?
The master plan that is produced for Singapore, which is a nation state, I accept. Mm-hmm. But the planning that goes on in that city is a renewal every three to 4 years of a 10-year rolling programme. Mm-hmm. A plan that gives assurance to investors, a plan that gives assurance to businesses, a plan that gives assurance to people who want to locate in the city. And we are as a country miles away from doing that. Even the National Infrastructure Plan does nothing but list projects, but it doesn't show the connectivity.
That's interesting. Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I just actually wanted to speak about one very particular piece of research that we've done over the last year, which is this document here, which is called Big Data in the Big Apple. And this is really all about how cities run themselves and how services can be improved. And the reason that Policy Exchange is interested in the city's devolution agenda is because cities are becoming an increasingly important part of our economic landscape. They're driving changes in labour markets, in output, in every other possible conceivable way. And they create policy challenges, but also allow us to look at new policy solutions as well. And this report is about something that's called the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics, which is a quite boring name for quite an interesting organisation. And it was conceived about 5 or 6 years ago by Mayor Bloomberg. And what he did was, given his background in using financial data to analyse things, was say to one of his staff, how do you use data, or can we use the data that a city produces to make our services work better for New Yorkers? And the guy he asked to do this was somebody called Mike Flowers, who was working at City Hall and had a background in legal services, but was inspired by data usage during his time in Iraq, where he saw a load of army econometricians looking at where explosive devices were used to better plot safe areas of cities. So he understood the power of data to improve things. And what Mayor Bloomberg said to him was, you've got a small budget, go out and see what you can do with the remit that I've got given you. So he hired an analyst and went out to the front line to understand what the challenges were faced by the people who were delivering the services within New York. And his kind of basic premise was that cities produce an enormous amount of data, from transport journeys, from housing needs, to business registrations, to licensing requirements, that cities don't necessarily use in a smart way to help them run better. And his first port of call was the fire service. So he went out to the firefighters of New York and he tried to understand how they ran their inspections regime, of which they conducted 25,000 every year. And so he listened to them, their experiences, and went away and found a load of data that could help them. And then he built a model that better predicted how fire service and fire inspections could work. And to give you an example of how big a change that was, in the first, prior to the model being built, the first 25% of inspections resulted in finding 20% of the most severe fire violations. After the model was constructed, the first 25% of inspections found 70% of the most severe violations. So that's an example of the power of data helping a city run better. There were other examples as well, such as finding restaurants that were illegally dumping cooking oil into the sewerage system, which was clogging up the drains, and finding out how rogue landlords were illegally modifying their buildings as well and over-occupying them. And what that provides is not only an example of how data has been used, but Mike Flowers' basic contention was that data on itself is of little value unless you have the expertise and skills to use it in a pragmatic way. And he also said there's a lot of cities around the world using expensive technologies to improve the way that they run, when in actual fact we improved the way New York was run with a small budget and a team of 2 or 3 analysts. Now the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics is used to design legislation, to look at ways in which economic development interventions can work, as well as helping run services as well. Now, obviously, this kind of system, we're not saying map it onto every city, because every city is different. If you look at the comparison between London and New York, similar in many ways, but ultimately the Mayor of New York's got a budget of about £45 billion. The Mayor of London's got a budget of £14 billion. London raises 26% of everything that it spends. New York raises about 70% of everything that it spends. But it still does tell us, in an era of increased devolution, that data can help us provide better services, analyse how things are running, and improve things. And the final thing I'll say is that I'm particularly interested in how this can help how these kind of systems can help cities run their welfare systems, because a lot of cities have got a stock of people who are claiming certain welfare benefits who aren't contributing to the labour market, and a more personalised approach and targeted approach of support could better help them get into work and improve the way cities run.
Thank you, Steve. Lord Holmes?
Thank you.
Could I put this microphone closer to you?
No, I'm sorry that you do have to hear what I'm saying now, so apologies to the audience. It was looking good for you then for a few minutes, but I'm afraid you've got to listen to it. If you've got some of those triangle sandwiches, just shove them in your ears. It will improve things, generally do. Particularly the cheese one, that'll be particularly filling. Thanks to Policy Exchange for this panel. There's a real problem with this. It's essential. It will potentially transform people's lives. Potentially, it will drive economic growth on a scale we've never seen before. But the difficulty is, so many of the pieces of this jigsaw, to many people out there, are just dull. People generally don't get excited by a lot of the elements, infrastructure, planning, urban renewal, all that stuff, and yet it's vital. So the key point, which Crew's already mentioned, is this is about leadership, and it's not about a strategy, it's not about a plan, though that's important. It's actually about having somebody who can paint and effectively communicate the vision and the mission for a city, for an area. All the plan, strategy, all that stuff fits beneath that, but somebody's got to say, this is the vision for this place, whichever city it is, because nobody, as a resident, as a citizen of that city, is going to get behind someone who says, I've got a 9-point plan, come with me. People follow because I've got a vision, this is what this place could be. Everything needs to say, this is the place to be, whether it's to live, to travel, to work, to play, this is the place to be. 3 T's which are essential to this: transport, talent, tech. How do you get the transport to be the system to connect efficiently and effectively all of these bits? How do you create an environment in terms of the public realm and housing where talented people want to come and be and commit? And how do you ensure that all of the tech is there, both in terms of infrastructure, hard and soft, to enable people to work effectively and at pace to make this stuff happen? I think the digital initiative I was involved with the Future Cities Catapult in Reading was very interesting. It joined together the City Council, businesses, public and private sector organisations and Microsoft to come up with a system of navigating around a city and connecting you to everything within that city in a very novel, innovative and insightful way. It's going to take connections across public, private, charity. Everybody who's in that space has to be part of this. It can't be anybody carried as passengers. Everybody's got to be on this journey and part of it, because everybody is in this space and has got to make it happen. Devolution is a key part of it, but it's not the whole story by any means. If you look at a bad example of devolution with so-called shared spaces, this is where you take away the curbs, the traffic signals, and you don't have a road or a pavement. You just have space where cars, buses and blind people, toddlers and tankers are all in the same shared space. That's a particularly bad example of where, if you have devolved powers and there isn't the understanding and crucially the guidance from the centre, the framework from the centre to enable and to assure, things can go badly wrong. If that's of more interest, look at the report I launched earlier this year, Accidents by Design. It gives an example of how it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing if you don't have the frameworks and the guidance from the centre to make it happen. So many things, but if you're going to focus on 3 T's, transport, talent, tech, that will make a huge difference, providing ultimately you have somebody who can absolutely effectively communicate the vision thing.
So you need a good mayor, is what you're saying?
You need somebody who can do that role, and a good mayor. If you look at this town here, look at Sir Howard, and look what has been achieved in Manchester. It's extraordinary.
But he's not the mayor.
No, but he's a figure. He's a figure who's been able to fulfil that role. So
strong leadership, not so much democracy. Mike.
Thanks, John. So I guess I speak to you as one of the architects of the Manchester devolution deal, having until 6 months ago been an employee of this city. and I'm now running my own business that's working with other regions and cities trying to secure devolution deals. And I guess I'd echo what we've heard, which is I think this is a huge opportunity. I think Manchester had the leadership. You know, the city I grew up in and left as a student was a place that no one rationally would want to go back to. Well, I think we all thought the cities were finished. In the early 80s, we were busy operating, you know, opening motorway junctions with business parks. We were getting people out of the cities. You know, there were very few people. Brian Robson on the far end of this platform was one of the very few people who was making the argument for cities back in the early 1980s. And I think the leadership of this city, at the same time as I would say that Alex Ferguson was transforming the world's greatest football team into a championship-winning enterprise once again. As Howard Bernstein was planning the transport and the renewal of the commercial housing stock, Bob Scott and others were bidding for Manchester to win the Olympic Games, and that sense of renewal is now shot through the city like letters through rock, and I think that the opportunity that Manchester has created for the capital cities of this country is one that we should all be excited by, because I think we've been embarrassed about our cities. We didn't really see our cities as being places that fix the housing problem or fix the skills problem, to take the two issues on our agenda today. We thought that was for national government. But to go to Steve's points on big data, I invite you to consider this for a minute. Can you imagine the same group of enterprises that gave us the NHS IT fiasco? Can you imagine them taking the data from Uber or Citymapper or Google Maps and using it to experiment with public services to create new forms of service that take user-generated data and innovating in the ways that I think is now starting to happen in London, New York, and other places? No, of course they couldn't, because they cover it in the same, you know, useless procurement rules we've got that completely stultify the public sector, because they've taken broadly sensible ideas from Europe and gold-plated them in a way that makes them virtually unusable. And anyone who's ever applied for public sector tender knows exactly what I'm talking about. No, what we need is innovation for some of these big problems. And so on homes, in the Manchester deal, you saw a £300 million revolving housing fund that deals with what we laughingly call the volume house builders, because they're not active in most of the cities, because there aren't the big sites that they like to deliver where they can make their returns easily. No, to unlock the housing potential of our cities requires new forms of intervention that get in earlier up the value chain, create the financial instruments to start to create developable sites, and that's what Manchester has signed up for, and it's what other cities are signing up for through devolution, to bring on new forms of supply, to de-risk sites, and to increase the capacity of our country to build homes in ways that we desperately need. On skills, go to your local college and look how many people are doing sub-NVQ 2 courses, sub-NVQ 1 courses. How many people are being trained as hairdressers and car mechanics versus engineers? The notion that our national skills system can fix the problems of our labour markets or rise to the opportunities is a nonsense. The experimentation we've seen through the Manchester deal, we've seen the Sheffield deal announced on Friday, and in more to come, I think is going to help us plan a new way of running public services, and in the case of skills, help us respond to those needs. And of course, that's exactly the way the NHS started. The NHS started with local authority cottage hospitals, and when William Beveridge went round writing the report during the war, he saw them and thought, let's take this local innovation and turn it into a national idea. So devolution isn't separate from national policy. It's a way we get more innovative national policy. And so in my concluding remarks, I'd say this is a great opportunity. And actually, I don't think we need to look anywhere else around the world for examples on this subject. There's many things we can learn from around the world, and we do all the time. But I think we've hit on an idea with metropolitan governance through this devolution process that I think is the envy of the world, and here's why. There isn't much of a market for creating big new structures of government around the world right now. Politicians aren't very much in favour. We can like that, we can loathe it, but I think it's a fact. What this metro devolution thing is enabling us to do, in the case of Manchester, creating not one new politician, not one new local government office job, is to take the power of 10 authorities to replace a PCC with a mayor and PCC, and to get these organisations working together across the single labour market, the single travel to work area, the single housing market that is Greater Manchester. This is metropolitan governance that overcomes the limitations of traditionally very small councils. And if you don't want to go through another local government reorganisation again, you don't want to create new government, metropolitan governance is as good a way as I can think of to fix some of these big issues that affect our cities. And I think that that's something that we, in 10 years' time, will be exporting to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Cheers, Mike. Just before I turn to Brian, on housing, you said we need to intervene further up the value chain, we need to de-risk sites. In plain English, does this mean kind of essentially give more power to people like Sir Howard so they can get building development permissions through quicker?
Yeah, because what you've got in a lot of the cities are brownfield sites, small sites, sites with complicated ownership, where an imperfectly functioning market leads developers, and particularly the volume house builders, to decide not to want to build. And by giving the £300 million fund, which I think Manchester's already leveraged into something like £1 billion, you create a financial vehicle that can get into those sites that have no value, very often negative value, start to prepare them for the market. Then you've got the public sector with the private sector taking a position in those sites as they come to market, as they get the planning permissions, as they're built on. You can then sell that interest on, and you get something back for it because you've basically rectified a market failure.
Cheers. Thank you. Brian.
Okay, fine, thanks. I'm afraid I'm an academic, so pithy doesn't come naturally to me, but argumentative might well do. And I'd like to throw a slight spanner in the works, because I think that George Osborne has got two rather competing agendas, which are, in a way, not necessarily compatible. Mike said that I've banged on about cities for donkey's years, and you can see from the colour of my hair that donkey's years are about right. I've also banged on about city regions rather than local authorities. And when George Osborne came up with his Northern Powerhouse, he was absolutely spot on. He was arguing in a way that if we want to rebalance the geography of the country, I mean, in this enormously centralised state that we live in, with the greater London dominating everything in the country, what we needed to do was to recognise the strengths of the two economically most plausible cities in the north, Manchester on the one hand, Leeds on the other, to create a node, a big enough node, to benefit from all the agglomeration economies, which economists bang on about all the time. How you do that, well, while at the same time encouraging 1,000 flowers to bloom up and down the country, 38 bids for devolution up and down the country from a curious mixture of counties, of cities, of odd bits of regions. I mean, how you do that and make them compatible, I haven't the first idea. What we really need to do, if we're trying to rebalance the geography of the country, is to replicate on a smaller scale something like the characteristics that London offers. I mean, the essence of London is that it's big, and therefore it does. I mean, it's got size and density and variability in spades. And that is one of the elements that we need to reproduce in the north. And it's also what geographers used to call, it's a polycentric area. There's a big node, but there are huge interconnections between all the various places around the southeast. And that notion of polycentricity requires there to be much better transport in the north, but it also requires there to be a big enough node to articulate the flows of contact and influence and so on and so forth, which are so important in a post-industrial society. So one of the things I've banged on about for endlessly is to try and build on what's happened in Manchester, and that's got all the essence of leadership and so on and so forth that's already been talked about. Build on that, but create something really big across the Pennines. And that's why it seems to me that Manchester Leeds is the obvious sort of node which starts to make sense. I don't know if any of you have ever travelled on the so-called Transpennine Express, which links Manchester and Leeds. It takes 50 minutes to travel just over 40 miles. It chundles along, and it is a ludicrous notion that that's how you bridge the Pennines. It seems to me that one of the things that George Osborne ought to be really prioritising is HS3, to link Manchester and Leeds in some pretty smooth, easy to get across way. Because one of the problems about not having a polycentric economy in the north is that almost all of the places, Liverpool, Sheffield, I mean, wherever it may be, they all tend to replicate each other. And so because they replicate each other, there's no big enough node to begin to capture the top end of financial services, of legal services, and so on and so forth. All of them get sucked into London. And so the essence, I think, well, two things. Scrap HS2 today. Or if you're going to do something about HS2, start it out from Leeds and do the northern bit, linking Leeds and Birmingham and Manchester. Give priority to HS3 to link Manchester and Leeds, and improve the intra-sub-regional transport links, which would bring together some of these places like Burnley and the Colne Valley towns and Sheffield and Liverpool and so on and so forth, to articulate a complex of places, all of which aren't necessarily competing against each other.
Thank you, Brian. Are you implying that Manchester should also take over Liverpool?
I think that when I say the two most plausible economic cities, one of the difficulties with Liverpool is that it hasn't got a catchment. It's what I call a cul-de-sac town. It's a bit like Hull. Well, actually, I mean, I don't want to insult both Liverpool and Hull simultaneously. There are a number of places in the country which actually are cul-de-sacs. You know, they don't have a 360-degree catchment. And if size is important, and all the agglomeration economy arguments suggest it is, Liverpool's just too small, and Hull's too small. And so to get a big complex, you probably need something like Manchester Leeds.
Okay. Thanks to the panel for keeping it pithy, sharp, argumentative. I'm now going to throw it open to your fine selves. If you ask a question, try and, because we've got quite a lot of people on the panel, so if you try and direct it to one, maybe two people, that'd be great. And make sure your question has a question. Oh, and introduce yourself to everyone. So name, background, star sign, if you like. Okay. Would anyone like to ask a question? This man would like to ask a question.
Thanks. Is that on? Yeah. Sorry, Jeff White from the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. It's probably not a professional question that I'm going to ask. It's because, as you can probably tell from my voice, I'm a Geordie. There's two questions. One is, no one's mentioned Newcastle or the North East here. Should the North East be part of the Northern Powerhouse, or is it a different economy and it's too far away from Manchester and Leeds? And secondly, on the point of leadership, Manchester's seen as being very lucky because you've got Bernstein and Lees. How do we get that effect elsewhere? How do we get leadership in the other regions? Because certainly in the North East, they spend more time arguing with each other than they do pushing an agenda.
Okay. I'm going to flip those two questions around. So, Chris and crew, if you could take this question of leadership and kind of based on your own experience, have you ever seen? I mean, not every city can either have the kind of the charismatic Boris or the kind of hyper efficient Howard Bernstein, Richard Lees combination. What advice, if any, do you have for cities that have kind of middling talent to try and raise that up a bit? And then I'll turn it over to Mike, Brian, Steve, maybe to ask about Geordies.
So let's just reflect on why Howard and Peter have been very successful at Manchester. So the first thing is they didn't just arrive on the landscape. They've been around for many times. When I was a local government officer, which was a very long time ago, we looked up to Howard Bernstein when he was a local government officer as somebody who embodied public sector ethos values. It's not to say he had a political ideology that we supported, but he had a very clear view of the role of a public servant delivering public services. I think that's a kind of vision and belief that still is instilled in both of them. So that's the first thing I would say about those two. The second observation I make is that, you know, I think the current government does put a condition on a number of freedoms around elected mayors and the like. What I think Howard and Peter have shown is you don't need to do that to get the deal. They have successfully negotiated a deal by working with the Chancellor and the Treasury officials. So that tells me that they had a very clear roadmap, they had a very clear view of what they wanted to negotiate on, and they were able to give personal commitments on behalf of a number of political leaders, because only one of them was a political leader in terms of democracy, if you think what I say. So my final point around leadership and how do you cultivate this leadership is we have to go back to getting people interested in delivering for the city. It's people, it's businesses, all its constituent parts. And some of that will naturally come from constituencies like the business. It may come from universities. It may just come from activism by actually engaging people much more in plurality, politics. So I do think that it is important for all leaders in a conurbation to think about who's the right person who represents their views, rather than an individual who wants to be a politician for the sake of being a politician.
Yeah.
I think that's what's going to work. So,
Yeah, I think to the point so Howard is phenomenal, but every community at every level has the people and the potential person who can truly be that leader. And it may be that they need support from others. It may need there are bits that they don't have in their personal toolkit, to use an expression that I don't want to use, but I just have, so there it is, it's out there. But you know, it's about seeking out and supporting, and those people needing to be developed in the same way that the places need to be developed. But be in no doubt, every place has a group of people and an individual who can come through and be that person. And absolutely, it has to be somebody who has that place in their heart, in their head, and can be utterly, utterly credible.
I'm just going to abuse briefly my chair privileges and say, I don't know, I mean, having reported from different parts of the country, not every place does have good people, actually, and some people are better than others. And I don't know, one thing I've always thought maybe could be a good policy idea, maybe for Policy Exchange to look in at some point is can you expand maybe, say, the civil service fast stream to cities, or some other kind of prestigious type graduate program? I don't know how. I don't know how that would work. But in the US, it seems like more of a prestigious thing if you're a young person to go work for New York, to go work for Chicago.
I say what we're up against. I remember,
Okay.
I like you, a former civil servant in the number 10 policy unit. I remember as the 2001 general election was called, Charlie Faulkner and I put a paper into the Prime Minister's box that said to Sir Richard Wilson, who was then the head of the civil service, that no one should get into the senior civil service unless they've done 2 years plus in a major city or parallel institution. I know for a fact that paper never found it into the Prime Minister's box, because the civil service doesn't work like that. It's very countercultural to do what you've just suggested. But that's
You don't even need to do it. You don't even need to do it through the civil
But
service.
that's exactly what we now need. Exactly what we now need.
Do you want to keep talking, or are you?
No, you
Okay.
carry on.
Brian,
I'll talk forever.
Geordies. Let's talk about Geordies.
Right.
We're just going to ignore them even more.
Okay.
You can add it to your list of Liverpool.
I am a Geordie, as it happens. I mean, I went to school in Newcastle, and Newcastle's a real problem. I mean, you know, if the argument's all about size and agglomeration economies, Tyne and Wear simply isn't big enough. And I mean, I think that what we need to do is to change our perspective on the country. You know, we tend to think of it as a north-south country. We need to start thinking of it as an east-west country. There's a very interesting programme which some conservative, the Cumbrian conservative politician, yeah, absolutely, did on, I think you call it the Borderland or some such thing, looking at the history of I mean, Newcastle and the lowlands of Scotland and so on and so forth. When I was a lad, we always used to see Cumbria as part of our back garden. And I mean, to start thinking about an east-west link begins to suggest the way in which perhaps Newcastle ought to start thinking. And I'd throw into that parts of the lowlands of Scotland, I mean, which would cause some very nice little political frisson up and down the country. But I mean, you'd actually then have, and actually, of course, the politics of the southern uplands are rather different from the rest. But that would create a very interesting complex, informally linking an east-west combination of Tyne and Wear, Tees, bits of the southern uplands and Cumbria. And actually you would then begin to think about something big enough to start matching the Edinburgh-Glasgow complex, the HS3 complex that I keep banging on about, and the rest of London. Yeah.
Steve, do you have any comments before we throw it back up?
Just a couple on your point about graduates going to work in and getting stocks of graduates working in different cities. I actually think that is possibly, not necessarily graduates, but certainly young professionals, is starting to happen already. Because the statistics show there's increased flows of people going out of London to go and work in places like Bristol, Manchester. And that's for two reasons. It's firstly because those cities have improved their offers, if I can phrase it like that. But also, London's just becoming a hard place to live for young professionals. God, it's like it's very expensive, it's very competitive, and the quality of life in certain aspects just aren't as good. On the Geordie point, as we'll call it, I used to work for a business lobby organisation that represented all across the UK, including Newcastle, North East, Manchester, Leeds, and it's much easier to kind of conceive of an idea where certain government functions or support functions can work across Manchester and Leeds together, but then adding Newcastle, say, for example, into that certainly seems to make it a lot more difficult. For example, UK trade and investment, you can quite happily see something where a joint strategy between Leeds and Manchester would work quite well because of the proximity of those two. Add Newcastle into the mix and it gets a little bit more complicated, potentially. Smart ticketing might be another example of transport networks.
But the counter-example to that is Bristol. I'd argue that you could say that Bristol is to London as Newcastle and Tyneside and Wearside are to the Northern Powerhouse. And Bristol happens to be one of the core cities that's got above average levels of wealth. So size matters, agglomeration is really important. I think Brian's absolutely right about that. But you know, the North East is the only region of the country that's a net exporter. You know, Nissan and Hitachi and others are putting massive investment in because they think they can make money out of the excellent labour force that's there. So I think with the right imagination, absolutely not trying to make Newcastle the same as Manchester or Leeds. It's got a very specific set of functions which, with good connectivity, can see it play a really important part in the Northern House in just the way that BAE and all those other great companies in Bristol are a fundamental part of southern England as well.
No, that's a massively important point, I think, for cities to look within themselves and to certainly look and see what's going on elsewhere, but not to try and simply replicate it. What are our specific elements? What do we have to bring to this? And that's where it really starts to get interesting, doesn't it?
Okay, right. Any more questions? Oh, go on. One from the back.
An economist, dangerous.
Hi, Miles Davis from KPMG.
No, sorry.
So, success in devolution, I think someone mentioned, requires investment in infrastructure. So my question is around the Chancellor's announcement to try and attract more institutional investor funding by pooling the resources of the pension schemes. Do you think that this represents a sea change and will deliver in terms of infrastructure investment? Or is it potentially another failed plot?
We'll just take the second question as well.
He's the economist.
Hi, Martin Turner from Manchester Economic Forecasting. Just a quick question to Brian and Mike. Agglomeration economies, how does international connectivity impact on what we traditionally consider as national agglomeration? London is the biggest city in the UK. What about Manchester building those international links? What about Newcastle building those international links? is that a route with modern technology coming on stream, the machine age, to actually get those agglomeration effects, maybe via the back door, via technology?
I want to ask one more question. Have them all in? Gentleman here.
Rob Bailey, I'm the Northwest Chairman of the Conservative Party. The devolution has been bundled with the health budgets. From the way you're talking, is that going to be a distraction from the economic activity, having those additional powers at the same time?
A question about the Chancellor's announcement that local authorities will pool their pension funds and try and invest in infrastructure, one on international connectivity and what cities can do there, and then one finally on whether the devolution of health and social care to Manchester that was announced, I think, earlier this year or last year, whether that will actually distract from growth. Does anyone want to take up any of these questions?
Are you looking
I'm
at
gonna go to you first, Brian.
The international dimension of agglomeration is clearly critically important. I mean, one of the reasons, of course, why London is so preeminent is because it's actually not a national city; it's an international city, the history of the empire and international linkages clearly underpins the massive contribution that London makes to the national economy. What you're suggesting about the potential for some of the provincial cities to build similar sorts of links and benefit from that agglomeration is absolutely right. And in a way, in this city, for instance, one only has to look at what's happening in Airport City with the huge investment which has gone in from China.
But Brian, if I'm Joe Anderson, if I'm mayor of Liverpool, and I've got, say, a couple of £100,000 to spend on some marketing or kind of trade promo, should I do that or should I spend that money kind of trying to forge greater links with Manchester businesses, or should I spend that on trying to kind of join a trade promo show in China or the United States or Ireland? Because that's the kind of decision you actually have to make. If you're, where would you kind of draw the line?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, that George Osborne has just come back from China, and he took Richard Leese and Joe Anderson with him. And Richard Leese clearly is making big inroads in many ways into investment from China in a way that Liverpool simply isn't. And I mean, I think that cities have to, they have to cut their cloth. And I mean, the extent to which, in the sort of scenario I've been trying to paint, where you've got this Manchester-Leeds node, with some of the other big cities in a way feeding into that. I mean, I think it's best in the first instance to get the national geospatial economy going, where London on the one hand and this northern node on the other might well make convincing bids for international investment.
Yeah.
We did some research about 2-3 years ago called Magnet Cities, and one aspect of that research was about taking post-industrial cities and just mapping out their experiences of reinvention. These are all outside of the UK, and we did that in order to come back to the UK and say to some of our cities, in the absence of a devolution deal, or even in addition to a devolution deal, what else could you do? And this point around international links is quite important, because it comes back to what our study found was that each one of those cities had created for themselves some form of USP where they could trade on a global stage, and therefore they weren't trading in their own country. They were linking to global trades. And whether that came because they had a historical link or because they found some natural resources that allowed them to reposition themselves was a matter for them to decide. But this is where the vision came in. There was a vision for a place, a city, and then they pursued that vision. But the other aspects of it which was quite important was the need to attract young wealth creators. So this is a generation of people who want to come and put roots down in the city, who want to create their own personal wealth and sense of well-being by being in that city, who will then carry on investing in and bring wealth into that city through their economic activity. So this is a very different concept to how we have traditionally gone and got USPs by bringing in manufacturing, for example, and creating jobs. This is attracting a new breed of a new generation of people who see an international city as a home and therefore start putting down roots. I just thought I'd just
Yeah.
mention that in that context.
Thanks for your mic, and if you could seamlessly answer the other two questions, that'd be grand as well.
So I think I have a modest amount of money in the Greater Manchester Pension Fund, so I'm kind of quite keen that that isn't squandered away on a mad exercise. I don't think that's what's going on here at all. If you go around the development industry conferences, what has been clear for 2 or 3 years is that even with the largesse of the government around Crossrail and other such massive developments, London's ability to come up with a pipeline of high-yielding investment opportunities is declining. And the relative prospects of the non-capital cities in this country are looking very much better as a result of that. And you can see that in what's going on in this city. You can see it what's going on in Birmingham, I think, with the news over the last few weeks, so which really demonstrates that in lots of ways. And I think markets are sticky, though. Investors are risk-averse. Behavioural economics tells us that we all keep doing the same things even though we know they're not the value maximising ones because we're risk averse. I think if what the Chancellor has announced leads to the public sector pension funds, whilst maintaining their duties to their pension fund pensioners and future obligations, if that can be put alongside or used to incentivise developers coming in to exploit those opportunities and to overcome those risk aversion, that degree of risk aversion, then I think he will have done us a very great service indeed. And I think that probably is what will happen if it's done right. I think it's potentially well timed, and it's actually for precisely the reason that Steve made earlier. It's one of the adages in the economic development industry is that it's a lot easier to move capital to talent than it is to move talent to capital. The talent's already spotting the opportunities. The young kids in the northern quarter in Manchester, in jewellery logistics in Birmingham, in central Leeds and other places, businesses want to be near them. They want to invest in them. And I think that what we could be doing is starting to ride the crest of a wave that was actually what saw London move east through Brick Lane and other places. And I think we should be very, very optimistic about that. No, I don't think health's a diversion. I don't think it's a diversion at all. It's for this reason. When this spending review is finished, if you're a local councillor, you're going to have the worst time you've ever known in your life because it's going to get worse. It's going to get a lot worse. And we simply cannot continue as a country to run our health service over here, which does, if you have a heart attack or you've got cancer, is as good as you'll find in the world. But if you've got chronic problems, just doesn't go near you because social care is underfunded, has historically been underfunded for generations, operates on a threshold of need basis that you can never get to prevention because you're always too concerned with dealing with acute problems. We cannot afford that. And as one Treasury official said to me, because I was involved in the devolution deal for Manchester on health, as one Treasury official said to me 18 months before that, we're going to have to do devolution for health because we haven't got any other ideas. I think it's that important. So it's not a diversion. And even if you just believe in the growth agenda, it's important. And here's why. You can do welfare to work till you're blue in the face, but if the people who are coming through your welfare to work programme have got complex mental health needs, substance misuse, family problems and all the rest of it, you need to have your mental health, your physical health, your social care services all working together or you don't move people on. And you have the same people cycling through schemes with 25% success rates. That is something we can't afford as a country anymore. So whilst I don't think it's a panacea, whilst I think it's a gamble for everybody involved, it's a well-judged gamble which I think other places would do well to replicate. And if we do, we'll be back to where William Beveridge was in the 1940s, trying to innovate a new and different model of running health and welfare.
We've got kind of 5-7 minutes to go. Just any other questions? Gentleman in the jacket, and then the gentleman who is
Hi, it's Jonathan Holt from
playing with his computer.
KPMG. It's been referred to a couple of times about the fact that you need a USP for your city. It'd be useful just to understand, take that forward and think about what that USP might be for the Northern Powerhouse.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Brian Connell, I'm a councillor and also with KPMG. My question's this: it seems to me that the devolution deals and a lot of the commentary from the panellists have reflected upon creating a vision and the requirements for setting a direction for for your own cities. I wonder, in the context of the business rate decision that was made yesterday, whether that changes your views and whether or not you'll end up with a much more informal, dispersed kind of land grab focused around just trying to get as much of that money, given the financial constraints that Mike has referred to.
Yes, who would like to talk about business rates and whether this is going to slowly, gradually see divergence between fast and slow-growing parts of the country?
John, I might have a go. Can I have a go at that one so I don't have to answer the other one, because that's a really hard question. So I think the devil's going to be in the detail on this one. And we've seen, it's a good conference announcement and, a bold move. Because I think it does. I saw a headline. I think it was in your paper. A partial reversal of Thatcherite centralisation of local government.
Those FT catchy headlines.
But I think it's right. But so here's the thing. I think two things have got to be right to make this work. What you do not want is to go back to a stampede between district councils in a conurbation like this, trying to subsidise investors to move there so you get people boundary hopping. There's ample economic evidence that we did as part of the Manchester Independent Economic Review done by Aston Business School, which shows very clearly that subsidies to business don't work in that sense. And if what he has unleashed yesterday is that, then I think that would be a very bad move. I very much doubt that that is what's been announced yesterday. I suspect we'll find that pools are what he's going to encourage, because that's what government policy has been for the last 5 years, and I think it's sensible. So pools of authorities working across natural areas to manage the risk as much as anything else, as well as to exploit the opportunity. So I think if it's about pools and not individual authorities, then it absolutely would get a tick in.
Isn't it also a great incentive for those city regions that are kind of wavering at the moment to actually get their mayor deal done?
If it's about pools, absolutely. Yeah. If not, then no. The second one is that I do not believe that this means the end of Grant. I do not believe that this means that Stockton-on-Tees is going to go to hell on a handcart and Reading's going to roar away with, and Islington's going to, or Camden's going to end up with billions of it's just not going to happen. This is simply not going to happen. And if it does happen, then I for one will have my placards out, because I think it would be utterly wrong. It would go against the grain of everything that being English is about, because it would be deeply unfair, because you would not be able to pay for basic services. I don't for a minute believe that's going to happen. So let's see the detail. I'm sure there'll be something that's about really incentivising areas to generate extra business rates, because they'll be able to maintain them, whilst at the same time having some mechanism to make sure that everyone's got enough to pay for services.
There was a great moment in the kind of the spin room yesterday when the Treasury spinners tried to pretend that they understood local government finance, and then the assembled press corps tried to pretend that they understood local government finance. So I'd just like to apologise for everyone for that. USPs.
I'll start. On USPs, I'm actually not sure. I'm just not sure that is the way cities should go necessarily. I mean, if you look just generally at kind of creating a competitive economy, it's based around a multitude of factors, such as whether you've got good human capital, good infrastructure, a strong regulatory regime. All those different things make you competitive as a country, and I don't see why they should necessarily be different making you competitive as a city. I would happily receive good examples of where a USP has led to strong city growth, so prove me wrong.
What about Glasgow's miles better? This is always my favourite tagline from Scottish cities. With the, well, that's it. It's Glasgow smiles better. Yeah.
I must say, a few years ago,
made you go to Glasgow?
It's a great place. It's a great place. Birmingham tried to do this a long while ago. I'm originally from the West Midlands, and they paid consultants lots and lots of bags of cash. And the slogan they came up for Birmingham, they offered 2. Up and Brumming. Up and Brumming. These are why you get consultants in. And the one that was actually chosen, Forward. Well, we're paying for it. So I think
wasn't it also Mussolini's?
It's Berlusconi's.
Berlusconi's.
Have you never heard one of Mussolini's speeches? There's definitely a black country twang in his voice. Get your black shirts on, everybody. But I think there is a real need for a vision thing. There is a need to think out USPs, not to contrive them, but many places have a USP, but crucially to put around that this whole concept of clusters. And you can see where you look around Cambridge with the tech cluster around there, look at places which have expertise in robotics at the moment, building those clusters and drawing it all together. And ultimately, as with all this stuff, you can't really improve on E.M. Forster, only connect.
In defence of USPs and the consulting business, I would just give two other examples. I think the point of certainly the references I made were about make sure as a city, as you go through your revitalisation and driving growth, you're driving this right type of growth. And the two examples I come across are Tel Aviv, which decided in its rehabilitation to focus very much on the young tech industry, and it now produces some of the best technology-minded professionals who will do some of the most innovative stuff. And the second one, a completely different example, is when you're faced with a complete decline, as Malmo was, is to rebuild the city around its natural resources, around its port, and therefore position itself as a port city. So again, I think these are the sort of things people need to look at. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but you want to avoid competing in your own country as well. You want to, you know, make sure you're linking into the global trades, I think. So
Very good.
Okay, fantastic. That's your hour of Metro conversation. Hope you enjoyed it. Just leaves me to say thank you to everyone on the panel, and I hope you will join me in offering them a warm round of applause. Thank you.